الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
إن الحمد لله ونستعينه ونستغفره وأعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله ونصلي ونسلم عليه وهو إمامنا وقدوتنا وحبيبنا ونحن مأمورون عن طريق القرآن أن نصلي عليه اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. We wanted to focus on an ayat from Surat Al-Baqarah which speaks to the reality of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam and the position of this ummah, in that this ummah was given Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam as a prophet. The Prophet Muhammad alayhi salatu wasalam, to revive the legacy of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam. And that legacy is testified to in these days, especially when we hear the takbirat and we see the hujjaj and we reflect upon the Kaaba. And at the end of the day, we say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wahdahu la sharika la, wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu rasul. The legacy of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam is the legacy in which there's a connection between the desire of the human being to have a correct understanding of how to function and live in this life, and the response of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. When the heart of the human being speaks out and cries out to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, Allah responds. It may not be the response that we want, but it's going to be the response that we need. That's why the power of dua, when we talk about the issue of making dua, which is really crying out to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, is a power that a lot of times we don't understand, and sometimes in the everyday life situations there's some signs that come to us even from those who don't believe. Take the example of those that are on hospital beds, and the doctor comes in the room and makes it clear what happened here is not the normal scientific process. Something took place here which goes against the normal process that we know. Even to the extent where before the whole role of the comfort of your family was not taken into consideration, and definitely not the power of dua. But even now, we begin to see that even the non-Muslims are seeing, just for the believers to have an understanding, the non-Muslims are seeing that people that take time out of their day to clear their minds, either to make dua or to reflect upon the meanings of life, that those people have a higher quality of life. So on a day like this day, the day of Arafat, which is the day of dua, we have to remember the value of that. But Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, he left the dua for us that is related by Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala in the Quran. It was inspired by Allah on the tongue of Ibrahim, recorded in the Quran as a testimony to where we should be. The ayat that we find in the Quran is وَإِذْ يَرْفَعُ إِبْرَاهِيمُ الْقَوَاعِدَ مِنَ الْبَيْتِ وَإِسْمَعِيلُ. And this ayat begins in the present tense in the Arabic language. And we know that the Quran يعني لا يعبر عن العبث. The Quran doesn't speak of things in a way that's not meaningful. So if the Quran is using يعني صيغة المضارع or the present tense, إذ يرفع إبراهيم القواعد من البيت وإسماعيل, then we pay attention. Because this form in the Arabic language is like it's happening right now. على الدوام وفي المستقبل. We find that reality that with consistency and in the present tense and in the future tense. إذ يرفع إبراهيم القواعد من البيت وإسماعيل. As though this event of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam and Ismail renewing or reviving the Kaaba is an event that will take place from here to the day of Yawm al-Qiyamah. The people will testify to the reality that Allah is one. It's not something that took place in the past. The Quran doesn't say إذ رفع إبراهيم القواعد من البيت. It doesn't say that. The Quran is saying وإذ يرفع إبراهيم القواعد من البيت وإسماعيل, also testifying to the fact that Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, and this is especially important for us, and I say this as brothers, as men, Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam didn't just testify to the oneness of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala by himself. But Ibrahim had at his side Ismail. He had his child at his side. And then we'll see in the rest of the dua that comes in the ayah that Ibrahim asked for his grandchildren and his grandchildren and his grandchildren and his grandchildren. Meaning that the issue of Iman is not just an issue of al-ibadah ala shakliyat. يعني الإيمان هنا يحتاج إلى تضحية. وهذه التضحية هي تضحية صعبة جدا. الحراسة على الأولاد. It takes a sacrifice from us. It takes a sacrifice from us. This sacrifice is not just a normal sacrifice, it's a heavy sacrifice to be guardians of our children. Because to be guardians of our children, while our children have the legacy of Iman, is to be guardians of Iman. Ismail didn't just come from nowhere. Ismail had a tarbiyah. Alayhi salatu wasalam. He was guided and he was groomed into being the person of Iman that he was. And we have to realize something. That Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam and Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam, and we mentioned this before, we mentioned it again, and we'll mention it now. They had nothing to do with the Arabs. They were from a completely different culture. A completely different geography, a completely different tribe and people. And we mentioned this so that we can reflect upon ourselves. Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, from a young age, he rejected the idea of shirk. And that rejection came within his own household. We have to understand that. He had a dialogue with his father on the reality of what it is that they believe and what it is that they practice. Can you imagine that at that time period, this youth is dialoguing with his father about what is the reality of the nature of life? Who is Allah? And he's going against what it is that his father and his people believe. And this is one of the reasons why Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam at a certain point had to leave his people, had to leave his family, had to leave his father. But he left the opposite legacy. Even though he ended up having to leave his land, his culture, his people, his family, his father, when he went to another part of the world where he had the ability to establish Tawheed, he ensured that his family was established. This is where we're losing ground. We're losing ground in our very homes. It doesn't benefit us to go into a new year of hijrah without understanding the meaning of hijrah, the sacrifice of hijrah, especially the hijrah of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam. يعني هذه الهجرة المقصود منها كان البناء، بناء الأسرة على أسس، وهذا يعني هذه الأسس أسس الإيمان. That was the end game of the reality of that moving from one place to another place. يعني المقصد لم يكون التجارة والربح، وهذا شيء حلال في الدين. Yani the end goal of that hijrah of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, of moving from one part of the earth to another part of the earth, the end game wasn't the issue of gaining profit and wealth. And we will never tell you that seeking in the earth profit and wealth is against the deen, because it's not against the deen. The property of the believer is sacred, just like the dignity of the believer is sacred. But here there's a wisdom that we have to learn before we lose ourselves in our entirety. And that is that the foundation of the Muslim Ummah, that foundation is the house of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. The foundation of the Muslim Ummah, that foundation is the family. And the foundation of the family is the heart of the believers. And if the heart of the believers is not set right with Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, then we are at war with ourselves. And it doesn't matter what it is that we're experiencing in the environment, we won't be able to deal with it. عشان القلب ما في استقرار في هذا القلب. والمعركة بين الإيمان والكفر في داخل هذا القلب. ولو يغلب الكفر على هذا القلب يعني خسرنا الدنيا كلها والآخرة. The battle between Iman and Kufr takes place right in our hearts. And if it's the case that Kufr overpowers our hearts, then we have lost in this dunya and the hereafter. We've lost ourselves. Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam wasn't satisfied with building masajid people. He could have been satisfied with building the Kaaba and that was it. And he could have been Amir al-Mu'mineen and made it known, I'm the one that established the Kaaba. I'm the one that brought in the chandeliers, and I'm the one that brought in the rugs, and I'm the one that brought in the money. He could have that attitude. But the attitude of Ibrahim was رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا. العمل شيء والقبول شيء آخر. The actions that we put forward is one thing. The udhiyah that we send to Allah is one thing. The zakat that we give is one thing. The salah that we offer is one thing. The dhikr that we make is one thing. But the acceptance from Allah is another thing. I'm always surprised, especially in this time period. We hear on a regular basis, even though now after the weakening of Saudi, there's a weakening of the concept as well. The minhaj of the Saleh, people say on a regular basis. The way of the Sahaba. But what was the way of the Sahaba? The Sahaba were not content with themselves. They considered themselves to be from the munafiqeen. Not literally, but in the sense that they looked at themselves, am I correct with Allah wa ta'ala? They understood the difference between the action and al-qabul, or the acceptance from Allah wa ta'ala. They understood that there was a possibility that they were not accepted by Allah. When we have that type of understanding, then we begin to change. Are we accepted by Allah wa ta'ala or not accepted? يعني هذه المصيبة الكبرى. أين نقف مع الله؟ وتعالوا هنا وتذكروا الموت معي. أنت أمام الموت ستدخل القبر. ما موقفي أمام الله تبارك وتعالى؟ أدخل القبر، وكيف أدخل هذا القبر وأنا أعرف نفسي؟ كل واحد لازم يعترف على نفسه. The scenario and the situation of being before the grave and asking yourself, what is my position between myself and Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala? I know myself. Is it going to be easy for us to say, رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا? The masajid that we build, that we fight over, that we go into the courts of America fighting each other over, can we say at the end of the day, رَبَّنَا تَقَبَّلْ مِنَّا? The life that we live on a daily basis, when no one is watching? Can we actually say that? وموقف القرآن موقف المراقبة والإخلاص. So the Quran comes and says, إنك أنت السميع العليم. No one can escape the knowledge of Allah. No one can escape the fact that Allah hears everything. Whether you say it or don't say it. And if you think you escape that, knows everything. Nothing is outside of the scope of the knowledge of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. ومن العجيب عجيب العجاب في هذا العصر. يعني ممكن واحد يكون ضعيف في الإيمان ولكن الشك في وجود الله هذا عجيب. One of the most strangest things in this time period. We could say easily that a person will be weak in Iman, but to have doubt in Allah? When we talk about the knowledge of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, the capacity of the human being to build these cameras, microphones, satellite dishes, if that's possible for the human being to have an understanding of, and the Quran is talking to us about Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala being a Sami'ul Alim, then how is it that we can have a doubt if before us is an ayah in the material world to show us that it's possible for this being to exist which knows and sees everything? If the human being can see from the sky from above by way of a weak satellite which can be destroyed with the wind or an asteroid, then what about the unseen? The Prophet ﷺ, when the Prophet came with the Quran, if it was the fact that it could be testified to as a lie, then everything that has been mentioned in the Quran that took place could have been eliminated by just the passing of time and history and updated and canceled out. إنك أنت السميع العليم. And then we end with this. Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam wasn't satisfied. رَبَّنَا وَاجْعَلْنَا مُسْلِمَيْنِ لَكِ. He didn't have kibr before Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. He asked Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala to make him and Ismail the people of Islam. وَمِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِنَا. And that's the question that we have. If Ibrahim had the strategic outlook of thinking about what is the future, he builds the institution, he raises the children, he raises an ummah, he has cooperation from his family in that process with all of the difficulty. And the reality of that situation is that it's difficult to doubt that, because there's an ummah in today's time that testifies to that reality, that's making hajj. There's an ummah that testifies to the oneness of Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. So if Ibrahim as a living human being, not as Freud has said and canceled out, and Freud is supposed to be from the followers of Musa, who said that Ibrahim didn't exist. We believe Ibrahim existed as a person. Ibrahim wasn't a tribe. Ibrahim was an individual, a person, a prophet. If the example of Ibrahim is such that we have to look at ourselves and what it is that we're doing in our hearts, and we have to build for Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. Not destroy, but build. And if we have to build, we have to do it with the right intention. If we're doing that with the right intention, with the strategic outlook, Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam looked to the future and asked Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala for the future that was to come. That came after much sacrifice, people. That came after leaving everything that he knew, alayhi salatu wasalam. If we don't begin to think like that, if we're just holding on to this and that because we're scared to go to the next level, we're scared to build for Allah and sacrifice at the next level, we're scared to deal with the changes that we have to deal with in order to save our families, in order to save our grandchildren, in order to save our youth, we're not going to go anywhere. That sacrifice of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam was one in which he was very clear on what direction that he was going in. So we ask Allah tabarak wa ta'ala to accept from us. And we ask Allah tabarak wa ta'ala to forgive us. And we ask Allah tabarak wa ta'ala to guide us. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. We ask Allah tabarak wa ta'ala on this day of Arafah to forgive us and to guide us and to help us and to aid us and to change our bad deeds into good deeds. And we beg you, Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, to preserve us and to allow us to die in the state of Islam and our children. We ask you, Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, to accept from us. We ask you, Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, to forgive those who have died from among us. We ask you, Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, to make your deen light for everyone. Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, we ask you to be those people that are a vehicle and a means for others to be guided. We ask you, Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, to protect this masjid and this community. And we ask you, Allah tabarak wa ta'ala, to establish it to the day of Yawm al-Qiyamah as the minaret of Iman. And our other masajid as well, Allah tabarak wa ta'ala. And we ask you for the poor of this ummah and the poor of the world, that you ease their conditions and their situations, Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And we ask for our brothers and our sisters that are incarcerated. We ask that you free them and that you aid them. And we ask for all of our community, Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala, that's under oppression, that you strengthen them and that you guide them and that you give them certainty of iman and you put hope in their hearts, Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala. And we ask Allah tabarak wa ta'ala that you alleviate their conditions. Aqimu salat.
الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا صراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا صراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. سمع الله لمن حمده.
الله أكبر. الله
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. Quick announcement. We will be having Eid Salah here. There'll be two Salats, one at 8 o'clock, one at 9 o'clock. Because of the rain, we had to cancel out. There's also, outside, there's 3 organizations that are doing Otiyah. Pure Hands for Yemen, Africa Relief for the African countries, and Islamic Relief, which includes some of the Arab countries like Palestine and other countries. The Eid Salah is at 8 o'clock, and the second one is at 9 o'clock. There's also the Eid Ladies Night Out, which is July 12th from 4:30 to 9 p.m. You have to register for that, and you go on the website in order to get that information, inshallah.